Welcome to Python Tutorials with Simplilearn. I'm Anjali and today we look into what tuples in Python are. So let's begin. Before we move ahead, let's have a look at everything that you learned today. So first we look at what exactly these tuples are. Then we'll see how you can create tuples in various ways, the difference between tuples and lists, accessing the elements in a tuple, the operations done on tuples, the built-in functions with tuples, converting the lists into tuples, then defining a tuple inside a list, and then we'll define lists inside a tuple, and finally we'll have a small exercise. So let's begin. What are tuples? A tuple is a collection of immutable heterogeneous Python objects. So if you have gone through our previous video on lists, you would have noticed that even list is a collection of heterogeneous Python objects. The only difference between tuple and list here. So the extra term that comes in case of tuples are that they're immutable. So over here, we have a tuple that's x, and within x, we'll store various elements, 1, 89, a single letter A, which is a string, also a word, which is again a string in Python, hey, O, and B. So as you can see, this tuple here may not be necessarily completely filled with integers, completely filled with floats or strings. It can be a mixture of all of these data elements. So that is one advantage we have when it comes to tuples and lists as compared to arrays. Because with arrays, you can have only one data type elements within it. Now we look at indices. So every element in a tuple takes up a position. And this position is what we refer to as an index. In plural, that's indices. So tuples positioning, or the indices for tuples and list strings also in case of Python and most other programming languages, starts with 0. So your element 1 is at the 0th position, your element 89 is at the 1st position, and so on, where B is at the 5th position. So in a way you can say that the length of your tuple x is 6, but then the last index of your tuple x is 5 because it starts from 0 onwards. So now that we have a basic idea of what a tuple is, let's begin with creating tuples. Creating tuples. Now the first thing that we are going to do is we'll create an empty tuple. So say my empty tuple's name is EMP. All you have to do to create an empty tuple is give these curved brackets with no elements inside. So this is a lot like lists, but in case of lists we had square brackets. In this case we have curved brackets. So that's the only difference. Now if I print the type of EMP, you'll see it's of class tuple. I can also print out just EMP. And since EMP is an empty tuple, there's no element within it. But then of course, the brackets are still printed because that's a list, because that is the basic characteristic of a tuple. So even if it's empty, these brackets would still be existing. So we saw how to create empty tuples, but how often do we actually use empty tuples? So let's put some elements into our tuple. So let's start with creating a tuple with just one element. So say my tuple's name is city and I'll have one element, Pune. If you're creating a tuple with one element, if you're not putting the brackets, it's completely valid as long as you have a comma after that particular element. So with this kind of a syntax, you can create a tuple. So I'll create a tuple, say city, and I'll just have one element within this, which is Pune. Now, if you're not putting this element within these curved brackets, that's very characteristic to tuples. It's completely okay while creating a tuple as long as you have a comma after your element. So although you have no element after this comma, that one single comma is important. So let me run this and just type of city. As you see, city has been stored as a tuple. Now in the most standard way of creating tuples, you'll say city and within brackets, you'll pass your element. Also print out city after that. And the same syntax can be used, and then you can also combine these both, although that's completely unnecessary effort, but it's possible. It does not result in an error. So you have your brackets and the comma. Works just fine. Now I want to add more elements to city because clearly Pune is not the only city we know. So Pune, Bangalore, these are some of the cities in India if you're from another country and wondering. So after this demo, you not only know tuples, you also know a few cities in another country. So I have 4 elements in this tuple, and this is how you create it. All the elements separated by commas and within brackets, print out city. Now I can do the same thing without the brackets too. Just the commas indicate that this is a tuple. Now those are the various ways you can create a tuple. Of course, all these ways do not come handy. Usually you use this method to create a tuple with n number of elements. And when it comes to one element, you usually go for this. Just put one element within the brackets. This is also used sometimes. Now another thing we saw while learning what a tuple is, or looking at the definition of a tuple, is the word immutable. So we said lists are mutable, which means that they can be changed, and tuples are immutable as in they cannot be changed. So here we'll see a small example as to what the difference between tuples and lists are when it comes to the execution of these both. So say I have a list 1, and that has elements 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I have a tuple, say tuple 1, which has the same elements 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now with list 1, I'll use this method that you probably have encountered before called append. So I say list dot append of 5. So what this function does is it adds 5 at the end of this list, which is list 1. Now we'll print out list 1. Run this code, and as you can see here, 5 has been concatenated to our list 1. Now let's try the very same thing in tuple. So tuple 1 dot append 5, and I'll run this, and see, you get an error here. So the tuple object has no attribute append. In fact, it has none of the functions which you usually use with lists, because these functions aim at changing the original list and not giving back a new list. In tuples case, you cannot change the original list. Once your tuple is set, that is how it's gonna be as long as it exists. So that is the main difference between lists and tuples. List is mutable, whereas tuple is immutable. And other than that, of course, you must have noticed the syntactic difference, which is lists are with square brackets and tuples may or may not use parentheses or the curved brackets. So every time you print out a tuple or you view a tuple, it's always got those brackets. But as you saw while creating a tuple, sometimes a comma is enough. So now let's access these elements in a tuple. If you want to print out the entire tuple, we already saw, just put it in a print statement, put the tuple list, put the tuple name in a print statement, and you'll have your tuple printed. Now, if you want to access some particular element of the tuple, say I want to take out Bangalore. So in that case, we use the indices as we saw earlier. Indices start from 0 and Bangalore is therefore at the first position. So I have to just say city and within square brackets 1. So this particular line or this syntax is exactly the same as you would use for a list or string. Just run that, and here we go. We have Bangalore. Now we can also extract elements from the end of the string, just like we did in case of list. So if I do not know the length of the string, now suppose I want to access the very last element of my tuple, but I have no clue as to what the length of my tuple is. In that case, what index do I use? Well, I can just go with -1. Now every time you give this minus sign, it starts accessing elements from the end of the tuple. So -1 means the first element from the end of the tuple, which is Mumbai. And that's what we got as our output. Now, although lists are immutable, there are a number of operations you can still perform on them. For example, the very first thing we look at is concatenation. So I already have my tuple city. We'll just print it out once again here to see what it consists of. Now we'll create another tuple, say num, and this will have the elements 1, 2, 3, 4. Now sure, I can't modify tuples, but I can definitely concatenate these two. So how do you do that? Extremely simple, city plus num. The plus sign works perfectly fine for concatenation. So I will print this out. And we have an error here. That is because we have not compiled our num list first. So our num list is not existing right now. I ran my line 19. Now I can run the next line. We have one complete list which has all the elements of city followed by the elements of num. Now you can also nest tuples. That is, you can have one tuple within another tuple. So far we have our tuple city and num. Now I will create another tuple. So first, now we already have our tuple city and num. What I'll do is I'll create a new list, say nest. So this is going to be a list. So we have our brackets here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a tuple within another tuple. So we have a new tuple. I'll call it nest. And since this is a tuple, the basic syntax, I'll have the brackets. Now what will be the elements within this? The elements would be my other two tuples, which are city and num. So I put in both my elements here. And let's see what nest contains now. So nest is a tuple which itself contains of other tuples which are city and num. So that is how you nest tuples. Extremely simple, isn't it? Now here's something else. Say I want to create a tuple rep which has an element Python, but that element is repeated 5 times. So what you would generally go for is type out Python 5 times. But thank God for Python, there's a much simpler way of doing this. Type in Python once and multiply this 5 times. Let's print out rep now. And as you see here, Python exists within this tuple 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now maybe this is not how you want to create your tuple. You want your tuple to just have that one element Python initially. But later on, while printing, you decide, you know what, I want Python to be printed 10 times within this tuple. Not a problem. Put your tuple name here and then go for it into 10. And as you see here, the tuple has now 10 elements within it. So guys, remember, when you're putting the statement here, it's not actually modifying the tuple, it's just printing it this way. So if I say rep once again and I run this tuple just has one element. So next we look at slicing in tuples. So we created our tuple num previously. I'll just print that out once again. So it has the elements 1, 2, 3, 4. Now suppose I want all the elements from 2 up till the end of this tuple to be printed. In that case, what I do is I go for slicing where I will mention my beginning and my end index. So my beginning index starting from 2 is of course 1. And my end index is basically the position 4 is at, or till the end of this tuple. Now when I want all the elements up till the end, I do not need to mention my end index. It's by default taken so. So if I just say num of 1 up till blank, run this, your tuple sliced, it gives out the elements at the first, second and third position. Considering 0th is our first position of course. Now you can also print this num tuple in reverse using these indices. So you say num, I leave my start and end index empty, give 2 colons, and then in the end I have -1. So when you put this -1 here, so it basically prints out the reverse of your tuple. Let's check that out. And as you see, your last element is now your first element, and your first element is now your last element. If you have any doubt regarding how slicing works, please check out our video on Python lists. Over there, we have a detailed description on how slicing is, and there will be no confusion since in case of slicing at least, tuples and lists are exactly similar. So let's look at this string that I have here, Simplilearn. Now I want every letter of the string Simplilearn to be an element of a tuple. How do I do this? Well, pass the string as a tuple. So write tuple of, and within this, you have your string, which is again within quotes, right? We'll run this command. And as you see here, every character is now a separate element in a tuple. So this procedure is called unpacking. Now I'll just print out my num tuple once again so we can see what's in it. Okay, so I want to put these elements which are inside a tuple into various variables. Now in this case, I know that my tuple has 4 elements. So I can have 4 variables A, B, C, D. And I'll put this equal to num. Run this and then I'll print out A, B, C and D. So every element of the tuple has gone into one of these variables. The first element went into A, second element into B and so on. Now what if we had no clue how many elements are there in num? In that case, I could say A, I want my first element to go into my first variable A no matter what. And I want my last element to go into this variable C no matter what. Now all the elements in between, I'm not very concerned about where they go. So in that case, I can have another variable B, but this variable will be a list. So the star indicates that B is a list, and then this is equal to num. We print out A, B and C. So you see what happens here is my first element went into A, and my second element went into C because these were clearly indicated. But every other element in between went into my list B. So that is how unpacking works. So since tuples are immutable, it's impossible to delete the elements within it. But that does not mean you cannot delete the tuple entirely. So that is what the del keyword does. We'll implement this. So I'll create a tuple, tuple 1, and put some elements into it, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'll use the del keyword. Now I'll just print out this tuple. So we know it exists and what all elements are within it. So great, our tuple is created. It has the elements 1, 2, 3, 4 within it. Now I'll use the del keyword to delete this tuple. So I say del space followed by your tuple name. Run this command. Now let's try printing tuple 1 once again. Of course, since we did it all right, hopefully, this tuple should not exist and this should result in an error. And it is resulting in an error. It says tuple 1 is not defined. So you can completely delete the tuple if not delete elements within the tuple. So as I mentioned previously, most of the methods that you have with lists does not work with tuples because these methods change the original list itself. But there are a few built-in functions which do work with tuples. They return values or new lists and they do not have any impact on the original tuple, so it works just fine. We'll explore some of these built-in functions. I'll continue using the tuple I created before, that's num. So I'll create a new tuple, num1, which has the elements 3, 5, say 4 2s, 6, 5, 8. And now we'll perform our built-in function operations on this num1 tuple. So the first one that we look at is counting the number of occurrences of a particular element. So that is the count function. So you give your tuple name dot count of and the element whose count you wanna know. So I want to know the number of 2s in my tuple num1. Run that, and as you see, there are 4 2s. Now you can also find the sum of all the elements within your tuple. So that is sum of num1. You just have your function sum, pass num1 to it. Now this sum function works for tuples, lists, everything. It's not a function particularly for tuples as such. So the sum of all the elements within our tuple is 35. And in a similar way, you also have the len function, which is in fact even used for strings. So len of num1 gives the number of elements within num1, which is 9. We have 9 elements. But remember, our last index is 8, not 9. Our element is 8 too, coincidentally. Now we have the max function for finding out the maximum number in your tuple. So say max of num1, which is 8. And we also have a function for checking the minimum of the numbers within our tuple, which is 2 in this particular case. So now list and tuple are very similar in the sense of what they hold. So what if I have a list, say LST, which holds the elements 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to convert this list to a tuple. So we'll see how that is done. First, I stored my list 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll just check the type of the variable LST, ensure that it's a list, which it is. Now we can convert this to a tuple. So to convert this to a tuple, enter your variable name and then pass your list name within these braces for the method tuple. Run this code and now let's print out TPL, and as you see, our list LST has been converted to a tuple. We can also check its type. So yeah, our conversion has worked out fine. Now this kind of a situation often arises when you put certain elements into a list. So you create a list that you desire and then you realize that you don't want this to be changed at all throughout the program. So then you can convert the list to a tuple. You cannot convert a tuple to a list though. So we previously saw how we can have nested tuples, that is tuples within tuples. Now we can also have tuples within lists. So we'll check that out now. Say I have a list LST and within this list I'll define my tuples. So 2 of the elements of my list LST will be separate tuples. I have a tuple 1, 2, 3 and I'll have another tuple as the second element of my list as 4, 5, 6. So I'll run this code, print out LST. So LST is created just fine. It's a list which holds 2 tuples. Now tuples are immutable, but lists are mutable. So we can add as many tuples as we want inside this list. So we can make modifications to the list. So I could say list.append and to this I'll pass another list which has 3 elements, say tuple inside list. Run this code. Now if I print out list, you'll see that the third tuple has also been added to the list. Now we can also remove tuples from the list. Just use the remove function. So lst.remove and within this I'll pass the list that I want removed, which is my first list in this case. So run that code and print out the value of LST to check what's in it right now. So our first list has been removed. Now we just saw how you can nest tuples within lists. Now we'll check out how we can nest lists within tuples. So I'll create a tuple TPL and within this tuple I'll have 2 elements, each of the elements being a list. So they have A, B, C in my first list and D, E, F in my second list. Run this and print out the value of tuple before we proceed. Yeah, so that's our tuple with 2 elements, each element a list. Now we cannot modify tuples. So initially when we had tuples within lists, we could add more tuples to that particular list. But now we have lists within tuples and we cannot add more elements to this already defined tuple. But what we can do is we can modify the list within the tuples. So I can add elements to the first element and the second element of my object tuple. So I'll try that out. If I say tuple 0 dot append. So when I say tuple 0, it's accessing the first element of the tuple, and the first element of a tuple is a list. So to this I can use the append function, and I'll append an element z. Run this code and then check out the elements within tuple. And in the similar manner, we can also remove elements from the list within this tuple. So I can say tpl of 0 dot remove z. And then print out tpl. So you see z has been removed here. Now just for the sake of it, let's see what happens when we try to add another list to this tuple. So I say tpl dot append and pass a list x, y, z and then print out tpl. So we get an error because this time our object was a tuple, not a list, and tuples cannot be changed. So with that we saw the many concepts that is used with tuple along with what tuple is. We'll quickly now have a very short exercise where we'll recall some of the concepts that we previously saw in this video. So what is this exercise that we're planning on doing? We'll initially create a tuple which has the digits from 0 up till 9 called tuple 1, and then we'll create another tuple by adding an element to this tuple 1. So we are not adding an element to tuple 1 and modifying the original tuple, but we are creating another tuple using the elements in tuple 1 and adding another to it. Then we'll create a tuple by adding the reverse of tuple 1 to this tuple. So first we have tuple 1 which has all the elements, then tuple 2 which has all the elements of tuple 1 plus another number, and then we have tuple 3 where we have all the elements of tuple 2 plus the reverse of tuple 1. So let's move on back to the Jupyter notebook. I'll create my tuple which is called series 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's my first tuple. And I'll print this out. So tuples created. Next thing we do is we create a second tuple which is series 1. Now series 1 will have all the elements of series plus another element which is 10. So how can we add another element to a tuple? So how can we add another element to this tuple without manually typing it out? Now as we saw previously, we can concatenate tuples. So we can say series 1 equal to series, and we'll add the second element as an element of another tuple. So instead of just saying 10, which is not possible because series is a tuple and 10 is an integer, we can say a tuple which just consists of 10. Run this code and print out series 1. So we have successfully been able to add another element to series and create another tuple series 1. Now we have to create a third tuple series 2 which will have all the elements of series 1 plus the reverse of series. So again we are going to use concatenation to bring both these tuples together. Say series 3 equal to series, and of course I can just say series and plus, but just for the sake of recalling once again how slicing works, so I'll put an 11 here, and now to that I'll add the reverse of series and not series 1. So I'll just make this correction in the previous one. It's supposed to be series 1 here and not series. And here I need to reverse it. So as we previously saw, I'll put -1 here and leave the beginning and end indexes empty. Run this and print out series 3. So we have all elements of series plus the 10 which makes up series 1. And then the reverse of series. So with this we come to an end of our Python tutorials where we learned about what tuples is. If you have any doubts regarding this, please post them in the comment section below and we'll definitely get back to you. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Also subscribe to our channel if you have not yet, as we have a lot more videos coming up. So keep learning. See you all next time.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.